Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. Setting a very dangerous precedent or necessary evil in exceptional cases. Those are the two sides of an ongoing debate on secret courts. This month, two men who've been identified only as AB and CD are due to stand trial behind closed doors, with the public barred from proceedings and journalists prevented from reporting the case. Despite appeals from activists, media officials and lawyers not to go ahead, they describe this as the biggest challenge ever to the British legal system. Let's take a look at this video report.
For the first time in modern history, the British government will hold a trial this month completely in secret. The identities of the two defendants, labelled as AB and CD, have not yet been disclosed. They are accused of possessing terrorist documents, while CD faces an additional charge under immigration laws of improperly obtaining a British passport. Under the provisions of the 2013 Justice and Security Act, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, has the authority to hold court cases that she deems a threat to national security behind closed doors, and to terminate High Court challenges against this on such grounds. Speaking to the BBC's Today programme last week, the Justice Secretary, Chris Grayling, defended the move, saying that he had confidence that the courts would weigh the issues of security and transparency carefully.
The default in our justice system should be transparency. We should not see situations where a large amount of our process in our courts system suddenly becomes secret. But what I would say is I know our senior judiciary well. I know they will want to protect the interests of justice, and I'm very confident that if they take the decision on a difficult matter like this, they will be doing so in the interests of justice.
However, this practice has many critics, with more than 700 QCs signing a petition early last year against the government bill. This list includes prominent barrister Ian MacDonald QC, who resigned from a government panel in 2004 over the then government's failure to recognise a House of Lords ruling that detaining terror suspects indefinitely is unlawful. Director of the Liberty campaign, Shami Chakrabarti, was particularly scathing of the government's policy.
Transparency isn't an optional luxury in the justice system. It's key to ensuring fairness and protecting the rule of law. This case is a worrying high watermark for secrecy in our courts, extensive restrictions set without robust reasoning or a time limit. There must be clearer explanations before the door is shut on press and public.
And many in the media on both sides of the political spectrum have attacked the government's plans for a secret trial, calling it a dangerous precedent for civil liberties in the UK. The Daily Mail is particularly critical of the bill, saying that the paper campaigned to expose what it could about the nature of the trial and the threat to democracy and openness that secret courts represent. Elsewhere, the left-wing commentator Owen Jones said that he agreed with the Daily Mail on the threat that this move poses to court impartiality in the UK.
Yet once this precedent is established and a centuries-old tradition of justice broken, it will be much easier to hold trials in total secrecy in future. If the state wishes to provide terrorists with ready-made propaganda, then flaunting its attacks on civil liberties is one way of going about it.
At the moment, the government looks set to press ahead with secret court proceedings, despite these criticisms. But should they go ahead, the use of secret courts will raise much more serious questions about the nature of our judicial system and the future of British civil liberties. Nathaniel Sansom, Islam Channel.
With me in the studio to discuss the significance of these court proceedings that are being conducted in total secrecy is Sagar Hussain, human rights lawyer and an advocate at CAGE, a human rights advocacy organisation that is working to empower communities impacted by the war on terror. Bernard Keenan, a former immigration solicitor who's currently a PhD candidate at the LSE, who researches the operation of closed material procedures in UK law. And Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour MP for Islington North. And on Skype, we're also joined by Margaret Gilmore, who's a Senior Associate Fellow with the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to you all. Well, Jeremy Corbyn, let me start with you. I mean, do you think these courts are, and these secret proceedings, the so-called closed material proceedings, are constitutional?
Well, we don't have a written constitution, but they're certainly against all the traditions of justice in this country. We thought we'd got rid of the Court of Star Chamber some hundreds of years ago. There's always been a process that any court can take some evidence in camera can take some witnesses in camera or under some form of protection. But what's new is the idea that we have a totally secret process in which the public are not allowed to know the case against the individuals are not allowed to know the full case against them, only the judge and the advocate for the prosecution knows the full story, even the advocate for the defendants under the SIAC, Special Immigration Appeals Court's procedures, is not allowed to know the full story and certainly not allowed to share it with the client. So we have an incredibly dangerous precedent. I can imagine the British government fulminating against this if this should be happening in Russia or in Zimbabwe or in Iran or any other country. I can just imagine the hyperbole they'd be using. Yet it's happening now in Britain, and then Chris Grayling says the default position is an open court. Well, since when did an open court with an open jury become the default position? Surely that is the basic position. And as I said, there's always been a facility, but it's a very marginal one, for protection of witnesses and some evidence. And that has been pretty generally accepted. What's never been accepted is the idea of a secret court.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, I mean, there have been a number of very high-profile security cases with partial secrecy. I mean, what can be so sensitive that the whole proceedings from start to finish are going to be barred to the public and the media in this case, do you think?
It will either be to do with the methodology used to get the evidence, or it will be to do with the security of the actual jury or the judge, or it will be to protect agents who are acting on our behalf and who are members of the security services. I do agree with Jeremy Corbyn that the first principle has to be openness and transparency, and I think it's very important that every time the government tries to do this, this is the first time, it should be challenged so that we do hear the proper reasoning has taken place on this. But I think also we have to trust the judges. And the one thing that isn't going to change is the integrity of the court case itself. The judges are independent, they're not going to bow to political pressure, the jury will still be there, and we have to believe and trust that they will not undermine the judicial process in that sense.
Well, you mentioned that it might be because of security to the judge and the jury. I mean, have there been cases already in British history where the jury has been hidden behind a screen, and even the judge hidden behind a screen, but the actual proceedings are open?
Yes, I believe there have, but I can't name them off the top of my head. But there have certainly been cases where intimidation has taken place, and there have had to be some kind of looking after the jury, some steps taken.
Well, there was a diplomat courts in Northern Ireland where a breach of that principle, and indeed there were juryless trials held with just a group of judges sitting on their own.
But these were juryless, and I believe
Indeed,
in this case there is a jury. There's a big difference.
Yeah.
Do you know of any cases where juries have had to be protected from so-called threats?
It has happened, but I think, for me, the really significant thing here is this idea of trust, which keeps coming up. And in this particular trial, as far as we know, there isn't going to be a closed material procedure, so there isn't going to be that sort of inequality of arms within the court itself.
There's not going to be.
As far as I'm aware, this is a publicity ban on a criminal trial, but within the actual criminal setting, the defence will have the opportunity to review the prosecution's evidence. There'll probably be strict limits on the exculpatory material that the prosecution has to disclose, and that can severely hinder a defence case. But this is slightly different from what we've seen emerging with SIAC and the operation of closed material procedures. But it comes down to this question of trust. The whole point of publicity, surely, it's a system of distrust. And we have to ask if we're supposed to be a public that just accepts things and believes them, or if we're a public who have the right to know about things that are done in our name. And that, for me, is the crucial question, and this, I think, is a very worrying precedent. And once these things enter into the legal system, and this really is the point where it does coincide with SIAC and closed material procedures.
SIAC is the Special Immigration Appeals Court.
Exactly, and that's where they do hold these closed material procedures where you have a very strong inequality of arms, as it were. But we saw with that once that became legitimated once, it very quickly becomes difficult to oppose it in other circumstances. So every time the state says that they need it, it's very difficult for a judge to then refuse it. So it's good that we've at least found out that this trial was going to take place, which wasn't the original position. But I think it's very worrying that this is proceeding.
I think the important thing is what you said, the context within which this has arisen, and the link with SIAC is very important, because I've been practicing law for about over 20 years now. And I want to sort of see in the context of my own personal experience in the legal profession and the way the governments, all governments since the early 90s in particular, have passed legislation which has given more and more and more power to the state. So we've had these debates about access to justice, whether it's fairness, equality of arms, etc. And after 9/11, it was, I think people just took their eye off the ball. The many commentators who had seen, or many MPs no doubt, took their eye off the ball and allowed the state or the security services behind it any powers, I would say, that they wanted. And I think the tipping point was the SIAC proceedings, the TPIMs, the control orders, where for the first time, I think, in a major sort of way, where person's liberty could be deprived without a criminal trial. I think that was the real tipping point. And there onwards, I think the security state has been pushing its luck, pushing its way. And in a way, just a couple of points very quickly, in a way you feel for the politicians and the judges, because when you're dealing with the security state, no politician, whether it's a cabinet minister or whether it's a judge, is going to have the courage or the ability to necessarily withstand that institutional pressure that comes along. And that's why I think it's a very, very dangerous development.
Well, Margaret Gilmore, I mean, Bernard Keenan has pointed out that the case will be, all the evidence will be made clear to the defence, so that it seems to be to do with threats to the judge or the jury. But surely...
it may not be to do with that. It could be to do with methodology. It could be to do with not naming agents and exposing agents out in the field. So it could be that as well. It's not necessarily down to the jury and judge. The one thing I would say, just in response to what I've just heard there, is that actually the judges over the last 15 years have really shown grit and independence. They have taken on the politicians when the politicians have perhaps brought in new rules and new laws in a knee-jerk kind of way, and those have been challenged in the courts, and the judges have found against the government time and time again. Control orders started as, detainment without any sort of trial whatsoever, and they're now down to TPIMs. They're a very, very different thing to locking people away in Belmarsh for years on end. So I think the courts have shown their independence. We have to show trust there, but I think we need better explanation. It's very clear, listening to this conversation, that we haven't had proper explanation of exactly what's going on. Not everybody understands that actually there will be a jury, that in this case the defence will see the allegations against them. Not enough is being done to get the messaging right so we understand what's going on. And secondly, the importance of the challenge. Really, really, that must happen. It is happening, but we need a good explanation on the final decision on that.
No, but fair enough, you say that the judges are independent and there's a history of them rejecting various things the government wanted. But nevertheless, on this case, it was taken to appeal whether it should be secret, and the judges upheld that it will be secret. So on this case, they haven't actually stood up to the government, have they?
On this case, they haven't stood up to the government, but I don't think that means that the government is unduly putting pressure on them one way or the other. I think the judges will be looking at what the law says and looking at the safety of everyone involved, and will have listened independently to both sides. I just don't think it would be right or proper to say, actually, we don't trust the judges anymore, because we don't have evidence to say that. The argument here is about how much can we put in the open. Now, I do think there is a tendency to where people can to go secret because it's easier. I think the judges will be taking that on board. I do believe they will have made the right decision, but I do think everybody involved must know that any decision to go secret will be challenged, always. It must not become a habit.
Well, Jeremy, you're nodding, shaking your head at that.
It might well be that we all believe the judges are independent, and the principle certainly is of independent judiciary, independent of the political system. That's fine. But if you have a secret court with the jury sworn to secrecy, we're not allowed to know anything about it, the government prosecutes an individual, the individual is found guilty and imprisoned, then to a lot of people outside, that looks like collusion. between the judiciary and the government. Now, the judiciary don't want that, and that's not on their agenda, but that is the effect of what is happening. So I think we should be extremely careful here on this one. And I suspect the real reason, I think Margaret alluded to this, is the question of the unaccountability of the security services, because this whole piece of legislation came about because the government was forced to pay a vast amount of compensation to various Libyan individuals who had been wrongly returned to Libya under the previous close relationship between Colonel Gaddafi and the Western governments in the latter part of Gaddafi's life. And they wanted to avoid that in the future. And indeed, in introducing this legislation, Ken Clarke said, in terms, it will save us a lot of money. And so there's a number of motives here, most of which are not very honourable.
Yeah. The Libyan issue is actually linked with what Margaret was saying about the independence of the judiciary. I, as a practitioner, do have now concerns that the judiciary is going to come under extreme pressure at the moment to comply with the wishes of the executive. We're not as bad as the American model at the moment, but certainly there are cases. And we talk about Libya, the Belhaj case, where he refused to accept the money. He simply wanted a remedy in court, where the judge decided against him. He says, well, you have a good case, but I can't do anything because it will upset our friends, which is the Americans, which in fact means that it will upset the government, and which also is a very poor decision, and hopefully it's been challenged and it's going to be dealt with. And secondly, the concern is that this mission creep has been developed in the war and terror of the last 10, 15 years. And this whole sort of development of the legal sort of principles, what we call a two-tier justice system, has been developing, where we feel that those charged under terrorism or linked to terrorism have a different kind of justice, and those who are non-terrorism have a different kind of justice coming. And I remember the phrase of Gillian Slavo from South Africa, who was actually one of the meetings we were at when we were talking about control orders in early 2000, where she said that this whole reliance on the judiciary and the legal profession must be very carefully monitored, because she gave an example of the laws in apartheid South Africa. When they initially were introduced, the biggest opponents were the legal profession, as Margaret says. They were very concerned about opposing the established principles. However, after 10, 15 years, by the time things were normalized, when it came to people's personal careers, personal advancements, personal interests, suddenly the legal profession was very complicit in the development of apartheid laws. And that is my concern here as well.
Well, Bernard Keenan, I mean, does it sound as though it's the Americans who are putting pressure on the British government and that they don't want, their methods to be revealed?
I think that was the concern behind the cases that led to the Justice and Security Act, which is when this.
But what about this case? I mean, this unusual procedure.
It's absolutely impossible to say what the circumstances are in this case, but I don't think it needs to necessarily be that the Americans are leaning on the judiciary, but I think that what has been said about this raises a lot of questions about what the judiciary is for and what the criminal justice system is for. And the problem that keeps coming up, and I think this has been alluded to, is that with the security services and the state coming in and basically telling a judge, we've made this decision or we want to make this decision, and the risk not only of what we're trying to stop, but also of actually having an open trial, that in itself creates a new order of risk. So please decide in our favour. What that effectively does is it puts the potential blame for things going wrong on the judge, and so it's a whole other order of decision making, and it's not something that the judiciary is supposed to be there for. We're supposed to have a legal system that assesses facts which have been settled and decides what's legal, what's illegal, what would be fair and what would be unfair. This is a situation where you have secret material, you have experts coming in from the state security and saying there's this inordinate risk, it can't be calculated, we can't tell you why. Please make a decision in our favour. And for a judge, it's not a question of distrusting judges. Judges always want to uphold principles that they have been educated in and they've practiced in for many years. That's not the thing that's in question. The point is that they're being put in this situation where it's almost an unanswerable question that's been asked to them. And I think that's why this continues to creep at each instance. I disagree that judges have always stood up to the government. I think that the cases where they have done that, for example, the Belmarsh case...
Let's get Margaret Gilmore back on that one. I mean, you talk about trust, we've got to trust the judiciary, but actually isn't it the government saying you've got to trust us? The judges are being asked to trust the government. I mean, is that fair to put that pressure on them?
The judges will get all the facts, the judges will get all the information. They are not making emotive decisions or decisions just to keep a politician happy. I haven't seen any evidence that these judges are going to say yes sir, no sir to the government. I think they will weigh it up. And who better knows about the first principle of openness than a judge? I think they will do everything they can to be out in the open, and I think they will be forced by the challenges to continue to look and look and look again. And I hope that the reasoning behind this will become clear, and the sooner the better. The one thing I would say, though, is that it mustn't become a habit, and let's make sure that the judges know they must look for every way possible to make these things public, because it's really important to us.
Why will the reasoning become known later on? It's a secret court, so how will we know the reasoning?
Well, it's a secret court now. It may be because they're waiting for a second and third court case. It may be because they're waiting for another investigation to finish. The truth is, we don't know. We don't know whether it needs to be secret for a short time, for a long time. We have no answers to that.
Yeah. Go back to the issue of the judges. I must have to say this. One of the leading judges, legendary judges, in the second half of the last century was called Lord Denning. Lord Denning, any law student, anybody in the legal profession will say, right at the top, as the top British judge. But what it was exposed with the Irish trials, with the miscarriage of justice, with the Birmingham bombing and various other cases that was exposed in the late 80s, early 90s, was that when they came to appeal around about 1980 about their conviction, the statement he said that it's absurd to think that our police would be beating people into confessions. This is the top judge in the second half of the 20th century, and yet 10 years later it was exposed that he was totally biased, totally untrustworthy. And I'm afraid judges are human beings. They have their own politics. They have their own prejudices. There's nothing wrong with that. The way to deal with that is to have open and transparent justice, so ordinary people through the media or whether through the public balcony can actually see who's been fair, who's not been fair.
Well, I'm afraid, sorry, on that note, Jeremy, we've got to...
And don't forget the jury as well. I mean, there is a jury there.
Thank you. We've got to end this first part of the discussion. We'll come back to it later. So thank you very much, Margaret Gilmore, for taking part. And in the second half of the programme, we'll be looking at the wider issues of whether there are other methods of dealing with terrorism than through secret courts.